The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, he'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
Hello people, welcome back to Ryedale for another run this week. Now all this week we're going to be seeing villages that are really small. They're that small in fact that most of them are just one great big long street with everything laid out along them. This is the parish of Scrayingham. Scrayingham, village of Scratty's people. This week we make a welcome return to Ryedale as I finally bring you to this particular run of parishes. I've put this batch off twice already in favour of others, so it's about time we saw them. We begin with Scrayingham, which used to be an East Riding village until 1974. It's located about 14 miles northeast of York. It has a horse riding school and a few smaller businesses. Housing wise, it's a mixture of modern stone cottages built in the Georgian style and traditional preserved cottages from earlier times. Whilst it's one of those places which could simply be described as small, linear and mostly residential, Scrayingham has a piece of history that isn't well known. If you step into its churchyard, you'll be sharing the same piece of ground with a man who helped to shape the railways. None other than the railway king himself, George Hudson, occupies one of the plots. We've mentioned Hudson a few times before, particularly in the East Riding series, but it's always been in the context of the railway. Here, we'll learn a lot more about him as a person. Scrayingham parish also extends eastwards to cover the hamlet of Leppington 2 miles away. We'll explore that too. Between both, there's a lot of fabulous North Yorkshire countryside, the sort we've come to be familiar with during our many previous trips to the county. Then again, this is Ryedale. You'd be hard pushed to describe it as anything but beautiful. George Hudson certainly struck lucky when it came to his final resting place. Let's go and find him and learn a bit more about Scrayingham, Leppington and everything in between. We start proceedings this week with the hamlet of Leppington, 2 miles away from Scrayingham village, but still part of the parish. Now, if you're an Australian, or you live down under otherwise, the name Leppington might mean something else to you. Leppington is a suburb of Sydney and was the birthplace of the city's convicted murderer, kidnapper and drug dealer, Anthony Parrish. That's not the only thing it's known for, but that's part of its past, I'm afraid. This, the North Yorkshire version, is far from similar. Whilst Leppington in Australia might be a thriving suburban metropolis, Leppington, North Yorkshire, is a quiet, peaceful hamlet laid out along one main road. The road connects Leppington to Leppington, the next village to the north, which is a much bigger affair. Leppington is residential for pretty much its entire length. From end to end, it's 1/3 of a mile. It's surrounded on all sides by the beautiful North Yorkshire countryside, meaning everyone who lives here will likely know every other soul in the place. That's my kind of village. There are no amenities here, it's far too small. It once had a church though back in medieval times when this was a much larger village. Today much of the medieval settlement lies beneath the houses and gardens of the modern village, although there are some earthworks in the fields nearby. Those earthworks include the site of a former moated manor house and the parish church of St Helen, as well as trackways and tofts. The moated site is sometimes known as Leppington Castle and it's roughly oval in plan. St Helen's Church continued in use as a chapel of ease until the beginning of the 20th century, being rebuilt in 1803 and restored in 1870 at the joint expense of Lady Viner and the rector of Scrayingham. However, it fell into ruin and was finally demolished in the 1980s. Where was the church, you ask? Well, I can show you. Now, we can't actually see it because, as you can see behind me there's a private track and it leads down to the site of the old church. I suppose with permission you could go and look at what remains these days, but I don't have that, so we need to move on and find something else to talk about. We're almost at the end of Leppington village, in fact, because from this point onwards there's not much more. It's just basically the rest of the road and in the distance some gorgeous North Yorkshire scenery. We're going to be seeing a bit more of that now as we take a drive between Leppington and Scrayingham village. At the time of Doomsday, the manor of Leppington was held by the Count of Mortain, later passing to the Melser or Mew family and subsequently to the Coreys. In 1626, a member of the Corey family was created Baron Corey of Leppington, although that title became extinct in 1661. The original moated manor house, which the earthworks show the site of now, was presumably abandoned in the post-medieval period when a new house was built on the site of Manor Farm. At some point prior to 1803, Leppington ceased to be its own parish, amalgamating as it did with Scrayingham. Both villages were under the ministry of the rector of Long Sutton. Let's drive across to Scrayingham now and see what that's like, shall we? Okay, so it's pretty much the same story here in Scrayingham as it was in Leppington. It's just basically one main road. Now, the big difference here is that at the end of this road, there's the church, and that is the sort of focal point of this entire episode. You'll see why when we get up there. But to get there, we have to basically just have another little amble. So let's. Scrayingham is not too dissimilar from the place we've just been to. Again, it's linear and mostly residential. It's slightly bigger than Leppington though, and can at least boast a church at its northern end. That is by far the biggest focal point here. You can tell as soon as you rock up here that this used to be an East Riding village. Some of the cottages are typical of those you'd find over the modern border. In essence, Scrayingham has that old East Riding feel to it, but still manages to be fairly cosmopolitan. Between some of the older buildings are newer infills and modern dwellings. It's still just as lush and green here as it was 2 miles away. Mind you, that's a trait we're accustomed to in Ryedale. Again, it's pretty quiet too. That fact is in part thanks to this being the only road through the village. Farming is the main economic activity in both Scrayingham and Leppington, but that's not to say there aren't any small businesses here. One that caught my eye on the map in Scrayingham was Vale of York Wedding Cars, who have a fleet of 6 classic motors, all chauffeur driven. Nice. At the southern end of the village are Lacey's Cottages, which are associated with the family-run and BHS-approved riding school and livery centre you can find here. It offers riding tuition on both horses and ponies and livery provisions for horse owners. Other trades and occupations that have been associated with Scrayingham in the past include 2 tailors, a cooper, and the landlord of a former pub called the Horse and Jockey. It certainly seems as if there's a horse-like theme out here. The pub no longer operates, and today the church stands alone as its most important feature. But what a feature it is. That massive building you've just seen there is the old rectory, which means we must be getting close to Scrayingham's church. And indeed we are, because just after passing the gates of the old rectory, the church does come into view. And there it is, on the bend, which turns right and goes through a little ford, or supposed to go through a ford. It's actually dry at the moment, and it leads to the road that then takes you to Leppington. So let's head for the church, because this is the main sort of focal point, as I said, in this particular episode. The building itself is absolutely fantastic, but it's what's in the churchyard that makes this one a little bit more interesting. For a long time, the Church of St Peter and St Paul was believed to have been of medieval origin, but all that changed a few years ago. Now, historians reckon it is instead much older. In fact, given its apparent Saxon origins, this is one of the oldest standing buildings in the entire county of Yorkshire. The Saxon discovery was made when Reverend Fran Wakefield, the vicar of St Peter and St Paul's, invited Peter Ryder, an independent building specialist who's worked on many other old churches, to inspect this one. Upon seeing the north wall, Ryder's jaw literally dropped. With its large stones and characteristic tiny windows, it was so different from other 13th century buildings he was used to seeing. Further research confirmed his suspicions that this was indeed far older. A lot of it is a Victorian rebuilding of the 13th century church it was originally believed to be. Indeed, it was remodelled and extended in 1853. Parts of its nave, though, show distinctive Anglo-Saxon features, and there's some other bits that are even older than that. Its walls, although thin, are built of massive blocks of gritstone, reused from a nearby Roman building of some kind. This would make sense. There were indeed Roman forts in the surrounding area, and the major Roman road from York to Malton runs close by too. If this was a Saxon church, there's evidence to back it up. Tradition dictates that King Edwin, the first Christian monarch of Northumbria, was baptised by Paulinus at York in 627 AD. His hall was at Aldby Park, just across the river. Scrayingham was perhaps once a monastery, and may have been a staging post where people such as St Ked stayed on their journeys north towards Lastingham, or others established on the North York moors. Another reason to visit Scrayingham's church comes in the form of a famous grave. As you walk up the drive towards the building, you may spy the final resting place of a man we know very, very well already. In several previous episodes across the East Riding, we learned a lot about George Hudson. George Hudson was nicknamed the Railway King. Born in 1800, he was a railway financier and politician and controlled a significant part of the railway network in the 1840s. He played a significant role in linking London to Edinburgh by rail, carrying out the first major merging of railway companies. He later developed York into a major railway junction. Although he was so proficient at what he did, Hudson's success was built on dubious financial practices, and he frequently paid shareholders out of capital rather than money his company had earned. Eventually, in 1849, a series of inquiries exposed his methods, although many leading them had benefited from and approved of Hudson's methods when it suited them. Hudson fell a long way, becoming bankrupt, and was even forced to live abroad to avoid arrest for debt. He only returned when imprisonment for debt was abolished in 1870. He died a year later and now lies here in the Hudson Plot in Scrayingham. Even though he's at rest in Scrayingham, Hudson was actually born in Howsham to John and Elizabeth Hudson on the 10th of March 1800. He was brought up by his older brothers William and John, and after a cursory education, he left Howsham at the age of 15. He was apprenticed to Bell and Nicholson, a firm of drapers in College Street, York. He finished his apprenticeship in 1820 and was taken on as a tradesman, eventually being given a share in the business as early as 1821. By 1827, the company was the largest business in York. So how did he get into the railways then? Well, fast forwarding to 1833, a group of York businessmen formed a railway committee. Their initial idea was to link York to Leeds, to enable the city to enjoy cheaper coal and emulate the success being enjoyed in some of the heavily industrialised West Yorkshire towns. Hudson was treasurer of this group and the largest shareholder. In the summer of 1834, Hudson met George Stephenson by chance in Whitby, and they became friends and business associates. He learnt of Stephenson's dream of a railway from London using a junction of the London and Birmingham Railway at Rugby through Derby and Leeds to Newcastle, but bypassing York. In 1835, the York Committee became the York and North Midland Railway, and it was Hudson who suggested a new line linking it to the North Midland Line at Normanton, a few miles southeast of Leeds. At the same time, there were other railways being planned, and they were all separate entities, competing with each other. Hudson knew that perhaps better than anyone, and even went so far as to purchase the Lonsborough estate just so he could stop one of his bitter enemies, George Lehman, in building a line of his own. Eventually, several lines and companies were merged. With his powerful influence and financial interest in so many railways, it was Hudson who played a great part in setting up the Railway Clearinghouse in 1842. One quote often attributed incorrectly to Hudson was that he would make all the railways come to York. There is no doubt he was instrumental in the fact that many did come to the city, but he was still opposed to GNR's plan to build one, saying instead their efforts to reach London would be better avoiding it. GNR would then abandon their plans for a new line and settled for running rights over two others in order that their services could reach York. Initial services between York and London ran via Doncaster, Retford, Lincoln and Boston, with the line through Grantham to Peterborough opening in 1852. York became a major junction station, and Hudson House was built on the site of the former YNMR terminus in the city itself, named of course after the man himself. Hudson House was demolished in 2018 and has since been replaced by a hotel and apartment complex. That still carries the name though. It's called the Hudson Quarter. York also has a George Hudson Street, which runs parallel to North Street. It was renamed Railway Street following his death, but in the 1980s the original name was reintroduced. Hudson was an MP for Sunderland and had ties to Whitby too. This then is definitely not the last we'll see or hear of him on TVI. When we reach both of those places, we'll fill in some more about Scrayingham's celebrity, the Railway King himself. Okay, so we've reached pretty much the end of the village. If you go a little bit further, you go through that dry ford I was talking about earlier, and sort of marking the end of the village is this beautiful property here, which I'm not totally sure if this is in the churchyard or whether it's just next door. I'm not actually totally sure what it is. It looks like an old schoolhouse, doesn't it? It could well be. It could well be. So now we're going to turn around and head back basically the other way, and that's really all there is to Scrayingham. Lovely place though, isn't it? And a great little place for the Railway King to be buried. One down and 4 to go this week in Ryedale. There will be something of a railway theme to these episodes, even though we're out in the countryside. Tomorrow though, we're veering away from it slightly. In the next episode, we'll be concentrating more on the ancient and medieval. Earlier in this video, we mentioned Oldby Park. Tomorrow, we'll be in the place where it's located. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.